Imagine the Great British Bake Off, but instead of cake, you get cursed swimwear, mortified Olympians, and a host wearing an intarsia pantsuit of his own body. That is episode 3 of The Game of Wool. In this episode, the briefs make no sense, the knitters do their best anyway, and the show proves that it doesn't actually know what knitting is for. So let's talk about why this show is starting to feel less like a celebration of craft and more like a novelty written by someone who thinks the whole thing is a joke. Game of Wool brings 10 knitters to Scotland to compete in weekly solo and group challenges for the title of Britain's Best Knitter. Each week, one knitter is crowned Big Knitter of the Week and awarded the Sheep Badge, and one knitter is cast off, which is what they call being eliminated. This week's theme is Holiday Week, and the challenges include knitted swimwear and crocheted deck chairs. And if you're thinking to yourself, knitted swimwear doesn't sound like a very good idea, you're already a few steps ahead of whoever designed this brief. Before we dive into what the crafters made this week, let's just talk for a moment about knitted swimwear, because can it be done? Sure, it can be done. There are some beautiful vintage patterns out there for knitted swimwear, and there are some modern designers who have also pulled it off. The issue isn't whether knitted swimwear can exist. The question is whether it's a good idea, because inherently, knitting is a pretty stretchy fabric, and so making swimwear out of it doesn't quite make sense, especially if you're making it out of cotton, getting it wet. It's going to stretch out of shape almost immediately. At best, that's going to be unflattering. At worst, you're going to expose yourself in a place where you really don't want to. There's a reason that most swimwear we see today is not knitted, and it's a functional issue. For this week's swimsuit challenge, competitors are tasked with knitting or crocheting a piece of swimwear that tells a story about a favorite holiday. It has to include some sort of accessories or embellishments. They suggest tassels and fringe. And it has to have a little bit of glamour. Knitters have 10 hours to complete this challenge, and besides the fact that we are essentially making a non-functional item, even Holger says these swimsuits are not meant to be worn in the water, there are just too many requirements here to make the actual swimsuit look good. So before you get a look at what the knitters created, I want to just call out that within the constraints of the challenge, I think they did a really excellent job trying to check all of those boxes. But if you're asking crafters to make an item out of knitting that isn't meant to be made out of knitting, there's only so much they can do. So if you are a non-crafter and you're looking at these and thinking they don't look good, that's probably why. Let's start with Isaac. He makes these swim trunks based on a favorite trip to the New River Gorge. He has a really interesting application here of intarsia, where he uses some brown reverse stockinette stitch to represent rock and blue stockinette stitch to represent water, and he even includes NRG in sparkly letters in the back of the swimsuit for a little bit of glamour. Because contestants are required to make an accessory for this challenge, Isaac goes ahead and crochets a interpretation of a chalk bag. It wouldn't hold any real climbing chalk, which he calls out, but it's something you could stick your phone and keys in while you're at the pool. But when it comes time for the judging, Di calls out that the colors just aren't bright enough and it doesn't scream glam to her. She then looks at Isaac and says, "I don't know if a rock climbing vacation is really very glam." Isaac says, "Fair enough." And I'm going to be really blunt here. Isaac is young. He's in his early 20s. How many glamorous vacations do we really expect him to have been on? How many glamorous vacations does the average person go on in their lifetime? I think the idea that the personal memory that Isaac chose as his inspiration for this prompt was somehow wrong because it isn't glamorous enough feels a little out of touch. Not everyone has the privilege to go on glamorous vacations. A sticking point for me with the way that these storytelling prompts are used, this very literal interpretation where the imagery in your Fair Isle sweater should literally represent your life. That's not usually how people infuse storytelling into their knits. For example, my favorite vacation-inspired knit is the socks I gave my husband on our wedding day. I bought the yarn on the trip we got engaged on, and then I knit him a plain pair of vanilla socks out of that yarn, gifted to him the morning of our wedding. Those socks are filled with meaning and storytelling for me and my husband, but they don't feature any intarsia, any Fair Isle, any literal imagery to tell that story. I think the way storytelling is used as a gimmick in these Game of Wool challenges is really out of touch with the way that knitters actually infuse storytelling into their craft. Next up is Dipti, and she crochets a sparkly granny square triangle bikini inspired by a trip to Las Vegas. I think this design was really wearable. I could actually see someone wearing this to like a festival or a rave, but then the judging begins and things go sideways. For episode 1, when contestants made Fair Isle vests, Tom Daly himself modeled their creations. But for episode 3, Tom invites a few of his team teammates from Team GB to model the swimsuits created by the contestants. And to be honest with you, these Olympians look positively mortified to be there. Enter Yasmin, and Yasmin is the only model that they're putting in female swimsuits, and so she does have to do a disproportionate amount of the modeling. And I really think it's Yaz's reactions that make this whole thing seem more like a hazing ritual than a fun modeling activity. Dipti's bathing suit only underscores that point. During the judging process, Di chuckles and says, "It's a little revealing, isn't it?" Cue the cut to the close-up of Yasmin's butt with the string bikini pulled all the way up there. But here's the thing. Di never intended her swimsuit to be a thong bikini. She intended it to have a front and a back panel, and when we see the swimsuit not on a model, when we see it laid out flat, there's a triangle for the front and the triangle for the back. Admittedly, I think Dipti must have included a little too much fabric in the crotch of the swimsuit. She must have made it a little bit too long. But instead of bunching the fabric between the model's legs, they chose to pull the back all the way up, creating a very dramatic wedgie as a visual punchline. As Yaz stands there, clearly embarrassed, Sheila asks her, "Is the swimsuit comfortable?" And I think pretty diplomatically, Yaz doesn't want to answer until Sheila pushes her to respond, and she finally says, politely, "I don't think I would wear these without pants underneath." How could they possibly be comfortable? She has a lot of crocheted fabric yanked way, way up in the back. That can't feel comfortable. That looks like a yeast infection that's just waiting to happen. The show is creating a situation where neither the model nor the swimwear are going to look good, and this is where you start to see the tension really rise between the show wanting to showcase a craft or just creating camp for comedic effect. Simon's suit is next. He's inspired by a trip to Disneyland Paris, and I'm going to be honest, Simon's suit doesn't look that awesome. The fit is a little bit off. He admits that it was kind of free-handed and maybe a little bit winging it. For the requirement to have an accessory, Simon crochets a utility belt, and he goes ahead and sticks some crochet hooks in there. It just doesn't quite look like something that anyone would truly wear to the beach. And I do wonder if Simon is poking a little bit of fun back at this challenge, and that feeling is only emphasized by the way that he speaks to Di during the judging. Di looks at his trunks and says, the lacing looks interesting. To which Simon says, "Do you really like it?" And Di looks at him and says, "I never said I liked it."
You really like it?
I didn't say I liked it.
Oh, right, okay.
Lydia knits a one-piece swimsuit with really elaborate bust shaping and a lace insert at the center of the torso. I think she did an amazing job. The problem is, with a knitted swimsuit, no matter how expertly it's done, at the end of the day, it's still going to look like a knitted swimsuit, and there's a limit to how sleek and sexy that can possibly look. The judges come around during the challenge. Di approaches Lydia. They're talking about the swimsuit construction, and Lydia looks at Di and says, "I really just wanted to make you proud, Di." At which point Di bursts into tears. In episodes 1 and 2, we saw Di cry at least once per episode, and each time, the knitter who made Di cry won the Big Knitter of the Week, and this week is no exception. Lydia will, spoiler alert, win Big Knitter of the Week. I think it's important to note that the technicals on the swimsuit are really, really incredible. The shaping, the attention to gauge, and when you're knitting with stockinette and lace in the same garment, you have to be really careful about gauge because your stitches per inch could change a lot, even if you're using the same yarn and needles. But none of that is mentioned in the judging. Instead, Di is hyper-focused on sex appeal. It feels like the judges are desperately trying to make sexy happen here. And the truth of the matter is, knitted swimsuits are just not inherently sexy. Now, don't get me wrong, knitwear can be super sexy. A negative ease ribbed turtleneck, a drapey off-the-shoulder mohair sweater, a really cute crop top. When you lean into knitting's strengths, it can look great, be sexy, effortless, cool. None of that translates to wet yarn, the addition of fringes and tassels, and runway wedgies. Right off the bat, the contestants are forced to fight the material instead of working with it because knitting a swimsuit is counter to knitting strengths and abilities. It's the perfect example of how the show keeps choosing briefs that undermine the craft right from the start. And it seems like the contestants are noticing that too. They are doing their very best within the confines of fairly ridiculous briefs, and they're stressed, they're not inspired, and it's starting to come out in their comments on screen. Ailsa makes a Harlequin-inspired two-piece, which is genuinely stunning. It shows a ton of skill, and the judges like it, although they find ways to nitpick on the way she's woven in her ends. Tracy makes a flower-adorned swimsuit, but Di picks on the fact that the flowers aren't quite opulent enough. Di says that fuchsias have lots of petals and gorgeousness, and these don't hit the mark for her. Stephanie makes a swimsuit inspired by her honeymoon. The judges say they don't love the endorments, and it's not quite glam enough. And then there's Holger, who blows away the rest of the competition for the third week in a row. He makes these gorgeous sculpted granny square shorts, which took a lot of engineering despite looking simple, and a string vest, which is probably the best application of the accessory requirement that we've seen so far in the episode. Guy says, I wouldn't have thought a string vest and granny square shorts would be sexy and glamorous, but they are, underscoring her desire to prove that knitting is sexy through this swimwear challenge. By episode 3, a pattern has emerged that is simply impossible to ignore. Game of Wool is asking knitters to make objects that knitting is simply not designed to produce. Swimsuits? Deck chairs? These aren't knitting challenges. They feel more like comedy gags. It would be like asking a potter to make a mug or a teapot with a giant hole at the bottom. Like, sure, they could technically do it, but it's producing a functional object that would act more as an art piece than its original intention. And when you continue to produce functionless, silly objects, it starts to make the whole craft look functionless and silly. Knitting is stretchy. It has the ability to be seamless. It has the ability to insert shaping into the fabric itself. It can be drapey, but it can also be structured. It can mold to the hollows and curves of your body. You can introduce elasticity with ribbing. You could introduce negative space with lace. You can create an entire garment from one unbroken piece of string. What knitting doesn't do well is holding tension the same way woven fabric does. It's not great at bearing a load. It's not great at holding its shape when it's wet. It will never behave like swimsuit lycra. It will never behave like upholstery webbing. It will never perform like canvas deck chair fabric. There is a reason that the fabric on those chairs is always woven. That fabric is serving a purpose. It would be like knitting a seatbelt. It might look nice, but it is not going to serve the function that that object needs to serve. When you force knitting into briefs that contradict the material's strengths, you are bound to wind up with an end result that looks silly, no matter how skilled or talented the knitter is. And this is why so many knitters feel uncomfortable with the show. It no longer feels like an avenue to showcase knitting's amazing abilities and applications. It feels like turning knitting into a punchline. After swimwear, we move on to the second challenge of the show, crochet deck chair, and I really think this is where the whole show loses the plot. Because if this is supposed to be the search for Britain's best knitter, and this episode really only featured 2 items that were knitted and the rest is crochet, it really feels like the challenges are completely misaligned with what we were promised as the show's premise. But even if we overlook the tagline, a deck chair is not something that is meant to be made out of crochet. Just like knitted swimwear, this task is not well suited to the medium, but let's set that thought aside and take a look at what the contestants are able to produce despite the limitations. For this challenge, participants must create a holiday-inspired deck chair. It must be practical, it must be functional, and it must be securely fitted to the frame. Elsa and Simon create a holiday scene with huts on the beach. They use a crochet shell stitch, which the judges really appreciate. Lydia and Tracy create a floral chair design, and we get a little bit of judging that mentions the placement of the florals and a little bit about the way the fabric dips and bows because of the way that it's been knotted. And if that feels a little bit more technical than we're used to, there's a reason. We have a guest judge on this episode. Janie Crowe, who is described as having crocheted for Justin Bieber, is the guest judge on this episode of Game of Wool. Having her on the show is so refreshing because she clearly knows her stuff, and the feedback we get from her is much more technical than what we're used to. She even picks up a crochet hook and demonstrates the technique, which as a very novice crocheter is amazing to me. Like, I loved seeing her demonstrate the difference between double and treble stitch. I loved having her use her hands to show it. It only took a second, but it really clarified what she was saying for me. And it just highlighted what I've been thirsty for this whole season. Technical explanations that show the viewer exactly why what the contestants are doing is amazing or inspiring or challenging or not well done. And it made me wonder, you know, this show, Game of Wool, is partnering with Rowan. We talked about it a little bit in the first and second episode recaps, which you can watch here. But Rowan has a relationship, a long relationship with Kay Fassett. He is a colorwork legend. And they also work with Debbie Bliss. And there are a lot of other famous UK-based knitwear designers who are legends, like Isolde Teague. Why haven't any of these legendary knitwear celebrities been guest judges on the show? It honestly makes me wonder if they just didn't want to associate with the program after they learned a little bit more about it, because they realized that it wouldn't be treating knitting with respect, it would be treating knitting like a punchline. But the inverse might be true. If this show was conceptualized as a whimsical, silly look at knitting, perhaps the writing team didn't want really advanced technical experts to be giving judging on the show, because it starts to take away some of the lighthearted, joking energy and make it feel a little bit more serious. There are 2 more deck chair designs. Holger and Isaac create this newspaper holding chips at the beach design. It's intarsia crochet. It was Holger's first attempt at intarsia crochet, which is crazy, and it looks really beautiful. Unfortunately, this chair didn't hold, but that didn't stop Holger and Isaac from getting 3rd place. And then there's Stephanie's. Even though this chair held and Holger and Isaac's chair didn't hold, Stephanie and Dipti's chair receives 4th place. And I think that just goes to show how subjective the judging has become. Even within a single challenge, the criteria shifts based on the narrative the show wants to tell. Functionality matters until it doesn't. Aesthetics matter until they don't. It's a knitting challenge until it's all about crochet. It's hard to watch this and feel like the competition is selecting for skill. Ultimately, Stephanie is sent home this week, and it's a little bit perplexing because she did produce a functional chair and another team did not, yet she's the one who was sent home. And when she expresses her disappointment, it's hard not to feel for her because the rules just don't make any sense. The briefs don't align with the realities of the craft. The storyline seems to be prioritizing drama over technique. There's a lot of tension, but it's not created by knitting itself. It's created by production choices. And I feel like the contestants are really starting to feel that. You can actually see the stress building week by week. And I think that's epitomized by Tom approaching Holger and saying, "Wow, you look focused." And Holger says back to him, "I'm stressed." Tom says, "How can you be stressed? You're knitting, you're crocheting. You can't be stressed when you're knitting and crocheting. That's what we do to relieve stress." And Isaac looks at Tom and says, "Have you been here the last 2 weeks?" Knitting can be relaxing. For many of us, it is relaxing, but not in this environment. And we saw Gordon become absolutely crushed when he was eliminated in episode 1. We see Dipti cry in episode 2. We see Meadow have to excuse herself. And now we see Holger, who is the peak of professionalism and preparedness, admitting that he's stressed. It feels really shocking. The show isn't sure if it wants to be a cozy hobby show or a timed competition. And I want to just zoom out for a second because I got a sprinkling of comments of people saying, "Why are you taking this all so seriously? It's just for fun. It's just a show. Just enjoy it." And it's true. There are a lot of more serious things happening in our world than a reality TV knitting competition. But the people on the show are real. They're not fictional characters created for our entertainment. They have reputations, they have careers, and they have real mental health they take with them after filming is over. When I see the contestants in the show becoming more and more stressed after each episode, it feels disturbing to watch, especially when the challenges themselves feel engineered for stress instead of creativity. The time limits have tightened each week. In the first episode, the group challenge allotted 40 hours to completion. The second group challenge gave about 20 hours, and the third group challenge gave 16. The timelines are really tightening here. The show wants the contestants to take each challenge very seriously, but they're treating the entire production like a running joke. It's not a healthy environment for anyone who's trying to produce their best work. If someone is edited to look incompetent, it follows them, it impacts their reputation. So yes, it is just a show, but there are real consequences and there is a whole craft community who's watching. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that the show wasn't created to celebrate craft, it was created to poke fun at it. And that's a very different premise than what most viewers thought they were signing up for. You can actually see it in 3 very distinct places: the hosting, the writing, and the challenge design. And don't get me wrong, I am not going to hate on Tom Daley. He's actually incredibly impressive, not just from his Olympic accomplishments, which are really astounding, but also because of the business he's built around knitting. Now, Tom Daley has like 3.5 million followers on his personal Instagram. He has 1.5 million on his knitting page alone. And that's bigger than almost any major knitting brand I can think of. It's bigger than Lion Brand. It's bigger than Rowan. It's bigger than Wool and the Gang. It's even bigger than Petite Knit. He has a best-selling knitting book. And just this week, he announced that he was going to help design the British flag bearer costume for the Winter Olympics. Like, he is blowing this knitting up into a super successful business, and you have to admire it. But because the Game of Wool has snagged Tom as their host, it feels like the show is molding itself around his preferences and interests. Tom Daley's perspective on knitting is pretty clear. He picked it up as a hobby during the Olympics to kind of help relieve stress, and he's never painted himself as an expert knitter. I think he actually represents the average knitter, which we need a little bit more of. Not everyone has to be an expert. One thing I love about Tom is he has such a distinct knitting style. His knits are colorful and campy and costumey and experimentative and bold. It's the perfect example of how knitting can serve as self-expression. It feels like the style of the challenges, whimsical and quirky and fun and a little silly, really echo Tom's knitwear style. And I can't help but think that this holiday challenge was all devised to get Tom into a swimsuit to re-emphasize and re-underscore Tom's history as an Olympic diver. The truth of the matter is, if the show had started with the tagline, the Tom Daily Knitting Show, I think that knitters would have tuned in with just as much excitement, but we would have been a little bit more prepared for what we were about to get. Giving it the tagline, Britain's Best Knitter, prepared us for a level of technicality and nuance that we aren't getting. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a show that's molded around Tom Daly's interests and style and fame, but I think that they should have been transparent about that from the start. The truth of the matter is, this show kind of feels like a joke, and although Tom delivers a lot of jokes in the show, I don't blame him for the tone. I think the reason the show feels like an SNL sketch is because they hired a comedy satire writer to create it. And once you realize that the show is created by a comedy writer, everything starts to fit into place. The focus on funny visuals, even at a model's expense, the lack of technical judging, the heart of the show treats knitting as something that's inherently funny, and then everything else follows from that. But it feels a little bit odd to talk about the impact on knitting and the treatment of knitting after an episode that focused almost entirely on crochet. And it's true that the most technical feedback we've gotten has been in the crochet episode from a crochet expert guest judge. All this goes to re-emphasize that this is not a knitting skills competition at the end of the day, it is a novelty craft competition. The end result is a competition that presents knitting as imprecise, non-technical, mostly decorative, and interchangeable with crochet, which couldn't be farther from the truth. Episode 3 is the clearest evidence we have that the show is not failing accidentally. It's failing based on the blueprint it was based on, that this was going to be a silly, whimsical, knitting joke where craft is the punchline. A host that leans colorful and campy, a writing team approaching knitting as comedy, a production team uninterested in the technical elements of the craft, and briefs chosen for spectacle and not skill. This is not a knitting show that sometimes gets silly. It is a silly show that is sometimes about craft, and episode 3 makes that undeniable. I am blown away by what the contestants have accomplished. They are still showing up with creativity, humor, and resilience, despite the restrictions that they're placed under for each challenge. I'm convinced that the Game of Wool was never really meant to be a true representation of knitting as a craft. It was meant to be kind of a whimsical, silly, slapstick-style show that is somehow craft adjacent, but that doesn't mean it can't still be entertaining. Now, if you're a knitter who was hoping to see a little bit of something different in the show of Game of Wool, a more accurate representation of the craft, I'm curious. What challenges would you have designed for a holiday week theme? And if more guest judges from the industry were brought on, who would you dream of seeing visit the show? Next week, the show is tackling children's fancy dress and wall hangings. So I'll be right here to break it all down. Until then, it's been really great to talk about knitting with you today, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye.